Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and a strange, awkward silence in the corner. At a corner table by the fire are two people. One of them is standing on a stage, tapping the microphone, and asking, "Is this thing on?" And that's me, Matthew Mellema, and welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help you connect the great story, the great stories, and our own stories in order to understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. So, as I just said, this podcast talks about faith, art, and storytelling. So, this has included lots of different art forms over the years. We have episodes talking about everything from serious novels to children's books to horror films to children's animated films to pop music to classical music to comic books to paintings to designing the interior of a home. Heck, we even have an episode where we interviewed a guy who made art by shooting high voltage electricity through blocks of wood. Check your archives, it's worth the time. So, it's well past time for us to talk about one of our culture's most important artistic forms, stand up comedy. It sounds a little strange, doesn't it? How can something as simple as a single person talking into a microphone in front of strangers, telling them funny observations and anecdotes, be one of our most important art forms? But the more I think about it, the more convinced I am that this is accurate. Stand up is all over places like Netflix and other major streamers. Comedians dominate both the podcast arenas and the YouTube clip arenas. They also have an outsized importance in the national conversation on a whole gamut of cultural issues. How did this all happen? Where did all these comedians come from? Is there a significance to stand up comedians beyond a few laughs? More fundamentally, how should we, as Christians, view the surprisingly ancient tradition of the comedian? Joining us at the table to discuss this issue is Jason Crawford. He is a professor of English at Union University, where he specializes in early modern literature and culture. He has also written an absolutely fantastic new book. Depending on when this episode posts, that book is either newly out or about to come out. The book is called God's Fools: Saints, Prophets, Martyrs in the Making of Modern Comedy. Professor Crawford, welcome to the Anselm Society Digital Pub Table.
Matt, thanks so much for having me. It's so great to be with you.
Yeah, and as I was telling you in the green room, I was reading your book in preparation for this, and I was absolutely loving it. Mandy Hauk, one of our co-hosts, was doing the same thing. She is out with laryngitis tonight, but she sends her appreciation to you. And let's talk about this because your book talks about modern comedy in general, but one of the aspects of that is stand-up comedians, which is something that really stood out to me. So I gave my little spiel in the intro talking about the importance of stand-up comedians in today's world, but I wonder if that is an objective thing or if that's just my perception. So I want to get your take here to start things off. I have this inchoate perception that stand-up comedy is kind of having a moment right now. Do you agree with that assessment, or would you say, well, no, stand-up comedy has been about this important for a long time? What's your take on the trajectory of stand-up comedy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably any of us can sense that probably in the past 25 years, comedy has, I mean, it's been popular in American culture for a long time. But since probably the turn of the century, there's been this new sort of urgency in stand-up comedy. In the early 2000s, you had all these political comedians who came along, the Colberts and Jon Stewarts and so forth, and people began looking to comedians as authoritative figures in I think this new way. Um, and it's just grown and grown and grown, and so it really does feel central to our culture wars, to our national conversation. And, noticing that back, maybe 7 or 8 years ago was what got me started thinking about this book. I mean, I'm as you said, I do Shakespeare, I do ancient stuff. I'm interested in a lot of ancient art forms, but comedy, which is an ancient art form, is it's different because you look around our culture and it's everywhere. You don't get that. I wrote a book about allegory. You don't see people don't get excited when you say I'm writing about allegory, but when you say comedy, everybody feels something. And so that's what I'm trying to sort out. How is it that this ancient form is still so vital right now? What's going on?
Yeah, and I want to talk about the roots of the form here in just a minute. But before we do, one final question on why you think comedy seems to be having a moment in our current age. One simple explanation would be like, well, the technology. Like you said, maybe about 10 years ago, Netflix started a concerted effort to kind of own stand-up comedies. Now, if you get on Netflix, there's this huge treasure trove of stand-up comedy specials, something we didn't have even like 15 or 20 years ago. So that's one explanation of podcasts. Every comedian has a podcast. Do you think there's anything beyond that, though? Do you think there's some cultural itch that comedians are scratching now?
Yeah, yeah, I do think you're right that there are all sorts of interesting sort of media and tech stories we could tell about the rise of cable, prestige TV, all these Netflix and podcasts and so forth. They've taken art forms that were more marginal and really brought them to the center of things. I think you're absolutely right about that. Um, but I do think there's something more, and I mean the whole thing I'm trying to explore in this book is whether comedy is expressing holy longing, essentially, whether it's actually doing what you could call religious work for us and actually meeting or at least expressing these longings we have for prophecy, forgiveness, grace, the hope of shalom, all these things that we are so hungry for. I think comedy is giving expression to those, and I think in an age of culture war, the hunger for those things takes on a new sort of urgency, and I see comedy addressing that.
And that's a point that you make really in a really compelling way throughout your book. And one of the questions that had been kind of bouncing around my mind for a while, even before I started reading your book, was the origins of stand up comedy, right? Because in a strict sense, it's a very new artistic
It
medium, right?
is, yeah,
I
yeah.
you could trace, like it got popularized in some instances by Bob Newhart, who had the first comedy album
Yep.
a few decades ago. Then Richard Pryor, kind of early in the modern era. I heard somewhere a theory that the sort of proto stand-up comedian was actually Mark Twain when he did one of his sort of tours of America, where he'd sort of stand up on a stage, give like his little anecdotes and his Mark Twain persona.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
But you trace back certain lineages, back beyond Pride, but you actually go back beyond Mark Twain for sort of the proto stand-up comedian. So take us on a quick crash course through the history of the stand-up comic. Where does he come from?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing when you think about stand-up comedy, if you ask, "What art form does it most resemble?" The answer really is preaching. It's, maybe lecturing, which is sort of what Mark Twain was doing. Um But that already is a kind of interesting clue. So I mean, as you go back, yeah, so you go, stand up as we know it kind of gets going in the 50s. You can go back to music halls and vaudeville houses before that. These traditions of clowning, you get it in Shakespeare's time where clowns would just get up and they would spritz. They would just, improv and talk and make fun of people in the crowd and that sort of thing. So you've got those traditions there, but once you get to that era, Shakespeare's era, these clowns and comedians are so aware that where I come from is this tradition of holy fools. It's these weird figures wandering around Europe who heal and prophesy, and they seem to be touched with this. Is it a deficiency? Is it a gift? They're strange. They're charismatic, and often they get canonized as saints, and there's this kind of connection to things that are holy, and they trace their own lineage back to Paul, the fool of Christ, back to figures like David, the little king, the Old Testament prophets, um, with their antics and strange theatrics, and so there I mean, you can actually trace a kind of lineage that gets us from, Bob Newhart back to the Bible. So it's interesting.
Absolutely. And yeah, this is something that I found just absolutely fascinating because, yeah, when you put it that way and you walk through this, just going through like the Old Testament prophets, we view it oftentimes like we read the prophecies in a very serious voice and we picture all these very stern men giving stern stuff. But some of the stuff they were doing, it has to have something approaching comedic value, right? Like Isaiah walked around naked for a few years. Like,
Yeah,
what? Like that's I think that's something that has some comedic value to it. So you
I
really need
know.
to expand it that way. So what was there anything in particular about the Old Testament prophets when you're going through this book? They're like, oh, that seems a heck of a lot like comedy.
Yeah, I mean, no, yeah, Isaiah walking around, I mean, how is that gonna land? Ezekiel sets his hair on fire. He cuts it off first, but he sets his hair on fire. Jeremiah walks around with a big yoke on his back, and you have to imagine that people are laughing. Now, it might not be the laughter of belief, it might be the laughter of scorn, right? But these are hilarious, wildly theatrical performances. Um, so it's hard. I mean, I think when I read the prophets, I always think of Flannery O'Connor, who is often shocking and is also very funny. And she made that famous comment once that my stories are so grotesque because it's the only way to shock people out of their spiritual complacency. Um, so I mean, the humor for her, which is outrageous, has this prophetic purpose. I got to wake people up, and I think that's what Isaiah is doing, and what Yahweh is telling him to do. You got to wake the people up, take your clothes off.
I just picture like Isaiah's kids like inviting their friends over to the house. The friends are like, "Your dad is he still doing like the naked thing? Okay, maybe I'll pass."
Oh my goodness.
But I want to walk through the breakdown you give of like because it's in the book you have sections on like saints, martyrs, and sort of walking through there. But before we
Right,
do,
right.
I'm interested in your Shakespeare connection. You've already touched on this, but a lot of your research and teaching focus is on Shakespeare. And I feel like a lot of folks, when they hear that, would be like, Shakespeare, is that really a good thing for like comedy stand up? But I think below the surface, there's actually a whole lot that those two subjects have in common. So, what did your experience with Shakespeare add to your research on this?
Yeah, yeah. Shakespeare is where it all began for me. I mean, that's kind of
Mhm.
it's the core of my love. And so I'm kind of, I mean, writing this book, I'm a Shakespeare guy, kind of pretending to be a comedy buff. Um, but one thing that I found so fascinating about Shakespeare in researching this book is that, he belongs to a company of actors. And he writes his plays for these particular performers. When he writes a play, he's saying, all right, Hamlet's going to be played by Richard. This role is going to be played by so and so, and he can hear them and see them as he's writing. And he always had in his company a professional comedian. It was the clown, and companies did this in that era. So, and his comedians, he had 2 of them, one in the first half of his career, one in the second. They were both celebrities in their own right. I mean, his second clown had a stand-up career before he would do, like, one-man shows, just get up and, do stuff with the audience, at least we think he did. And, they brought their own brand of comedy to the work he's doing, and the second clown in his company, it's the guy who did King Lear's Fool, he did Feste and Twelfth Night, did Touchstone, and As You Like It, he's this crazy character who I write about in the book, who, I mean, he's prophetic, he's weird, he's confrontational, he seems to have been physically atypical in some way, and is very he makes that part of his persona in ways that can be really uncomfortable at times. But he's also challenging his audience. How are you responding to me? Um, and why are you here laughing at me? And so, I mean, there's this real confrontational sense of things in this particular clown. And it comes into Shakespeare's, when King Lear's fool comes on prophesying and confronting and just talking nonsense. It's this guy's brand of comedy. Shakespeare's just letting his comedian do his thing, really. So it's a fascinating little piece of history there.
Oh, it absolutely is. In this second kind, we can use the word comedian for it almost because he was such a fascinating character, and you open the chapter there giving the best sort of recreation you can of what his stage performance might have been. It seems like we really don't know. We have descriptions of it that seem kind of vague. So you're doing your best to piece it together, but it was such a fascinating just sort of tableau because it's almost like he's standing at like this crossroads between on one hand like the medieval jester, the holy fool tradition behind him, and then looking ahead to like the stand-up comedian, the vaudeville ahead of him. So he's sort of like this character who has one foot in both doors. So it
Absolutely.
was just absolutely fascinating.
And he's one of the first comedians who became rich too. Um, and that's an interesting kind of pointing forward. He died a really wealthy man because he was good at what he did. Um, which, holy fools don't get that ending typically.
Another way that he's leading the way. He's setting the standard for rich holy fools, a whole new category. Again, you divide your book in a very fascinating way between sort of like showcasing how different types of comedians can sort of shine a different light on this idea of God's fools. And the first way you do that is through the saints archetype. You use Saint Francis of Assisi and various other figures. So let's talk about that. What do you mean by the saint archetype, and what is that adding to this sort of comedy scene?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think Francis is a good paradigm for the saint. He is really funny. He's really funny. He goes around singing in bad French, which everybody laughs at. He preaches to animals, which we kind of sentimentalize now. But he knew then this is ridiculous. I mean, people are falling off their chairs when he does stuff like this. So he's a really funny guy, but he's funny because he's strange. And, when you think about even just the word saint, um, which it's sanctus, it's holy, this word means set apart, right? I mean, it means strange, essentially, not belonging to this world. So here comes Francis, and he's dressed like a beggar. He's talking to the animals. Um, he's rejoicing. He'll do crazy things like the worse his clothing looks, the louder he'll sing his praises. I mean, it's just these crazy reversals. And he'll meet somebody whose clothes look worse than his. He's like, "Whoa, like that guy's got dung all over him. I have to have it." He'll say, "Hey, can we trade?" Um, and so that strangeness is hilarious, but he also is always challenging us to see I'm strange because I belong to another kingdom. I'm a citizen of somewhere else. It's a place where poverty is actually a kind of wealth, and suffering actually begets joy, and so forth. Those who are small overcome those who are powerful. And so, as we're laughing at him and as he's showing us this hilarity, he's actually also trying to show us holiness. He's trying to show us what does it look like to belong to this other kingdom, to be set apart in this way. Um, so that's where I think saintliness and funniness can actually really live close to each other. I think he's a really fun figure in that way.
Yeah, and you connected this to some modern comedic works, and the one that really stood out to me because, like, yeah, this is exactly what we're talking about is from the movie Elf, right?
Yeah,
Where the
yeah,
character Buddy the Elf, Will Ferrell, he's this innocent, right? He comes in, he's from a different land with different rules and different values, and he comes in being very naive and caring and trusting, and seeing him interact with normal, cynical, jaded people is the source of 90% of the comedy. So it seems like even today that sort of template of sort of the innocence set loose among the real world, it's a really fertile ground for comedy.
absolutely. There's so many comedies where you've got this kind of overgrown child. He's innocent, he's naive, he's ridiculously out of place, and somehow he redeems the world, And I love the Buddy the Elf thing. It's got an incarnation narrative in a way, like he comes down to earth, and yeah, it's, uh, it's great.
Absolutely. So another movie that made me think about it because me and my kids watched it recently. I think What About Bob's a good example about this too,
Yes,
where
yes.
yeah, where Bob, so the Bill Murray character, he's kind of this innocent, right? He's deeply neurotic. He has all these mental illnesses, so he latches on innocently, just out of the goodness of his heart, to this very pompous, very self-important psychiatrist. Embeds himself with the psychiatrist's family, and through his goodness he makes all of his psychiatrist family love him, and the psychiatrist himself is driven to madness by this man's goodness. You're just like,
Yes.
oh, that's actually a really great moral message in this silly comedy.
Yeah, he is a kind of holy fool, isn't he, Bob Wiley? Um,
Bob Wiley as a modern Francis of Assisi.
yeah, and yeah, I mean, he's got this effervescence of joy that doesn't seem like it's not coming from New York City. Where is it coming from, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's sort of the first archetype, the saint. The next type is the prophet, and this is one that can get a little more gritty, little darker. But what are the prophets here adding to this sort of
Yeah,
comedy
yeah,
tapestry?
yeah. I mean, that, when we've been talking about comedy as giving us pictures of shalom, right? It's a world made new, it's innocence, it's joy, all good, all true. But the other thing comedy does always is show us human corruption. I mean, think about how many comedies you've seen that just show us awful people doing awful things. And the point is the awfulness. It's an art form that's really interested in moral boundaries and moral transgression. And I think, stand-up comedians especially, maybe because their medium is so much like preaching, they're just getting up and
Hmm.
telling us things. They really do tend to spend a lot of time, telling us what's wrong and also embodying themselves what's wrong, and that's kind of one of the things I discovered in writing this book is that as prophets, comedians, they aren't just naming wrong, they actually tend to embody it. So if a comedian is
Hmm.
gonna get up and talk about gluttony, what she's gonna talk about is, "I ate a whole carton of ice cream last night." It isn't you, it's me.
Hmm.
And then by implication, it's you. So there's this kind of self-sacrifice involved, and, um, it gets to be really complicated in that way. But they're calling I mean, comedians, they call us out, and this why they get tangled up in culture wars. They're asking the moral questions that we all know we need to be asking and maybe aren't quite comfortable, giving voice to.
Yeah, and a distinction that you draw in those chapters is the sort of the prophet who is confessing his own sin and the prophet who's pointing out other people's sin, and you can see clear examples in both of these, right? The ones pointing out other sin, I think the clearest example in today's culture would be like the John Olivers, the Jon Stewart, sort of the Colbert, especially during the Colbert Report.
Right,
Those
yeah.
were fascinating, but also very difficult lines to walk. And you touched on this as well, where they kind of sometimes want to have it both ways. We're like, oh, I'm a clown, but also take my message seriously. And that's a hard line to walk. And then you have this other side where it's the people who are making the moral case through the lens of their own moral failures. You talk about Richard Pryor, probably the most famous example of this, who gets a lot of comedic material from just his own incredibly complicated, messed up life.
Yes.
You also mentioned, I think John Mulaney's a great example of this. The comedian of my generation, where he famously falls off the wagon, goes through this horrible drug addiction thing a few years ago, then has a comedy special talking about it, which I found absolutely fascinating because he's just given the perspective of it. So tell me what you thought about this line between the prophets who are like standing on almost this pedestal, and the prophets are like doing the confession as well.
Yeah, yeah. It's such an interesting question. And it is striking how many um comedians we've seen in recent years doing what John Mulaney does. I mean, just get up and saying, I messed up. I'm broken. Here it all is. Yeah, there's this whole subgenre of mental health related comedy where comedians will get up and say, I'm bipolar. Here's what it's like, and it's very raw. So you've got this extreme vulnerability that so many comedians are cultivating, and then you've got also, as you say, these comedians who just seem angry, and they're confronting the world's corruption with a flamethrower. I mean, just going after it, and um, so I'm really interested. I mean, where's the relationship between those 2 kinds of comedy? And I find myself worrying, I mean, I think a lot of us do. I've heard a lot of people say in the past, oh, I don't know, 3, 4 years that it seems like comedians are getting angrier. Even a lot of the political comedians who kinda made their names in the early 2000s, they're just mad now. And, the danger, I think, is that if you start fighting corrupt power by exerting more and more and more force in the form of anger or really cutting wit, whatever it is, are you just fighting the corruption with more corruption? You know what I mean? And I think that's where this is what comedy I mean, we can all argue and be angry all day long, but what comedy offers is that vulnerability where I'm getting up and it's the line of evil being drawn right through the middle of my own
Mhm.
heart.
Yeah.
I'm actually showing you my own sins. Let's confront the corruption, but you can't just blast the enemy away because it's us, it's me. And that's where I think comedy is maybe offering us a different kind of moral fury, a different kind of moral discourse.
Yeah, and like you said, it's such a hard line to draw. It's a difficult tightrope to walk. And I think one of the most interesting examples of this, again, you bring him up in the book, is Dave Chappelle, where he has a fascinating life story where he in the early 2000s he's extremely successful with the Dave Chappelle show. He's about to make a ton of money, then he walks away because he feels like the comedy's like going askew. It's not having the intended effect. He comes back now for the stand-up specials, and I will say, just in terms of, I think he's about the most talented stand-up there is. He's right up near at
Sure,
the top.
sure.
Just an incredible talent. He says a lot of things that don't map very neatly onto the culture war stuff, but by his own design, makes the listeners very like. I There's some parts where I'm laughing uproariously at what he's saying. The next time he's like, "Oh, that makes me super uncomfortable. I don't know,
Yes,
but should I keep
yes.
watching this?" So, what do you think somebody like him is doing in this broader conversation?
Yeah, it's meant to make us squirm. which is
Hmm.
a hard thing to confront. And I mean, my sense is that Chappelle really pushes it right to the line. Because I mean, we all know there's humor and there's comedy that's just purely vile. You know,
Hmm.
it's performers who are using this license just to engage in um, nastiness. It's
Hmm.
abusive, it's cruel, it trivializes pain and evil, it's obscene, and, Chappelle's always pushing yeah, so I mean, it can make you squirm, it can push right up to that limit, but I think he is trying to test the limits, of what we can say and still live together, you know? How far can I go and still be forgiven? And are my transgressions helping you to see your own transgressions? I mean, I think there's a kind of, he's got that one special, which I read about a little bit, where he talks about Bill Cosby for much of the special, who's this hero of his who we now learn is this moral monster. And he's trying to make sense of that. And he does it by actually playing the part of the moral monster himself and the jokes he's telling. And so it's this really bizarre and kind of dangerous artistry. Um, but I mean, even like I've been watching a lot of Nate Bargatze lately with um, my middle schooler, and even a comedian like this, who is like, he's not trying to make us squirm. He's not daring us to walk out. He's not being obscene and hideous in the way that Chappelle is always playing at. But he's getting up there and talking about how he eats too much of all the wrong foods, how he's too dumb to read a book, how he fights with his wife. I mean, he's showing us sins in the same
Hmm.
way, and then asking us, "Can you forgive? Can you uh,
Hmm.
can you go here with me and can we live together even in the midst of these frailties and these corruptions?"
Yeah, and I think you make the point at one part where part of it it's a confession, but it's also a communal confession where the humor behind it, like Nate Bargatze talk about eating all the airheads and nerds, where part of the humor there is assuming that we all can sympathize with him, right? It's like, yep, we've all been there. It's
Yes,
almost this
yes.
solidarity thing to it.
There is, absolutely.
Yeah, so now let's go to the martyr. So this is one that might be the most counterintuitive when you're first approaching the book, but you talk about the role of martyrs throughout church history, then up through comedy history, drawing this link between them. So tell me about the comedy of martyrdom.
Oh, it's fantastic. This was one of my favorite discoveries in writing this book. Um, there are a bunch of early lives of martyrs that were produced in the early church, and so many of them are so funny, which is, of course, not what you expect to find. Um, but, they're being stage managed by the Romans. These are public spectacles. You're in the arena, you're being, torn apart by lions or executed by soldiers or whatever. And these martyrs would get up, they would crack one liners, they would steal the show, they would pull pranks, they would laugh while they're supposed to be suffering and weeping. And there are these amazing, it's like this anti-gravity, this person is supposed to be crushed in this spectacle of Roman power,
Mhm.
and she turns out to be buoyant with life. Um, so there's this fantastic comedy that just plays out again and again in one martyr's story after the next. It's great, and
Yeah, and I especially love the example of Saint Lawrence. I believe he's the patron saint of comedians.
some people say, yeah,
Yeah, where famously he's after pulling basically this you could almost call it the practical joke on the Roman consul. He's condemned to the most painful death the consul can imagine, and he's burned alive on this sort of grill. And as he's being burned and all blistered, he looks around. He's like, "Hey, I think I'm done on this side. Maybe flip me over." And it's like, like it's on part of it, that's like that's just cool to have that sort of presence of mind when you're in immense pain, but also like you said, it's flipping it on its head. It's showing that there's something beyond just the pain and suffering there. So yeah, what are some other sort of like common links you find between these comedian martyrs?
Yeah, no, it's a great joke from St. Lawrence, and it's another one of these kind of revelatory moments where you see another order of things breaking in. With your eyes of flesh, what you see is a body on fire. It stinks like
Mhm,
burning flesh. It's
mhm,
doing what burning flesh does. Um, but Lawrence is here to show us through this joke and this laughter that this is a man who's blazing with life. And there's this great
mhm,
line in the ancient text that tells his story that says, "For Christ is the true fire." Here's a man
mhm,
who's on fire in more ways than one. So you get that great revelation there. And I think it's a beautiful picture of the weak overcoming the strong. And when it comes back around, like you can even see it a little bit in that Buddy the Elf scenario, where it's, this is not the person we expected to overcome, but here we are. And so many of the early martyrs, I mean, they're young women, they're slaves, they're old people. I mean, people who in the economy of Roman society had no power. And from that place of littleness, they are um, bringing this laughter that just tears it all down. I mean, they ruin these Roman shows of power. So the loss becomes a victory, which is a fascinating thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And another point you made was the larger Christian point of even death not having the final word. That there's something beyond that. I was actually reading this section made me think of my grandmother who passed away almost 2 years ago, and when she was brought into her assisted living care, we all knew she was in congestive heart failure. She had maybe a few months to live. She knew this, but she was just filled with joy. She was always
Mm,
telling jokes, playing pranks. At one point, some of the nurses took my parents aside, like, "We're a little worried about your mom. She doesn't seem to be taking this seriously enough." And we found out that this meant her impending death,
yes.
right? Because
Yeah,
for
yeah.
her, and like she was cracking jokes literally on her deathbed that me and the family still repeat. But like the thing about her was she just had this confidence in this piece that, like, yeah, I'm about to die, but that's not going to be the final word. So that's this the small fact of my impending death is not going to dominate everything else. And that's this a very similar attitude to what we see throughout the martyrs. It's this power of, like, the laughter is almost this reminder that the things of this world will not in the last accounting be the most important things.
It's such a beautiful story, my goodness. And you're right. I mean, that her laughter is an expression of faith, and it's this picture of that shalom, which is greater than death. Yeah, I love it. I love it.
Yeah, and we are unfortunately running a little low on time, but before we go, I was wondering if there are any stand-up comedians, or if you want to broaden it out, just like comedy movies, anything else that you think does a good job illustrate that would be good companion pieces to your book, God's Fools.
Oh yeah, thanks. I mean, let's just say Shakespeare, Midsummer Night's Dream, it's got it all. It's all there. I was struck, I was on a road trip with my kids a couple weeks ago, and we listened to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. We got all these Roald Dahl audiobooks, and I thought to myself, "Oh my goodness, it's all here." The the moral condemnation,
mm,
it's all these awful children, it's every childhood sin you could imagine is being exposed and punished. It's a kind of throne of judgment,
uh-huh,
but then in the end, there's the one child who inherits the kingdom, and, there's, the chocolate that for others was a vice, now for him becomes a feast. Um, So there's not exactly a wedding supper of the Lamb, but there's something here. There's a kind of beautiful apocalypse at the end. So there you go, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
That is a perfect recommendation. That's just the sort of thing I was looking
All
for.
right.
So yes, so listeners, again, please buy the book God's Fools, Saints, Prophets, Martyrs, and the Making of Modern Comedy by Jason Crawford. So Professor Crawford, where can we find you? Where can we find your book?
Yeah, I'm on Substack, Jason Crawford, or Jason M. Crawford, I think it is. And you can find me there. You can find my book on Amazon or at Bloomsbury. And there's a discount right now, so go check it out. It is out. It's out and available.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you once again. Really appreciate it. Again, listeners, please do check this out. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. And as you all can probably tell, listeners, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire is down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.